Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good morning, friends. How are we doing on this fine rainy morning? Well, it's a pleasure to have you here this morning. My name is Bill Harmer. I'm the Executive Director of the Westport Library. What an honor it is for us to continue to be able to partner with our friends at the Wise Men of Westport and Weston to bring opportunities like the one that we have this morning with Senator Blumenthal to our community. I know I've said this before in front of this audience, but it bears repeating that I can't think of a more appropriate place than a public library to have programming like this. We believe strongly in our role as a hub for the community and as a place where everyone can come to learn, grow, and engage in lively discussion and respectful conversation. So again, thank you for coming out on this rainy morning. Grab a cup of coffee, have a donut, and without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome my friend to the stage, Wiseman Chair Speaker, Bruce Borner.
Some people don't know what the Wise Men are, so give a brief description. The Wise Men are a group of high-functioning, sexy men, 400 strong, who are retired or semi-retired. We have 25 activity subgroups. In the beginning, Wise Men used to meet at the YMCA, hence the name Wise Men. We are indeed Wise Men, with a W, and occasionally wise guys. If you do now or have once lived in Westport or Weston, please consider joining us. If you Google Wise Men, spelled Y''S Men, our website link comes right up. Each week, the Wise Men host a speaker. Often we partner with the Westport Library, and today is such a day. Our speaker today is someone we all know from his selfless service to the great state of Connecticut and from his frequent appearances on national news and on the Stein-Krause Bridge and on the front lawn of the library. Richard Dick Blumenthal was sworn in on January 2011 as United States Senator from the state of Connecticut. His father fled Nazi Germany at the age of 18, and his mother left the farm life in Nebraska to become a social worker. He's worked hard and studied hard at Harvard College and Yale Law School, where he was classmates with Bill Clinton and co-editor of the Law Journal, the Yale Law Journal, with Robert Reich. His time as U.S. attorney for Connecticut was spent prosecuting drug trafficking, organized and white-collar crime, civil rights violations, consumer fraud, and environmental pollution. As senator, Dick has aggressively enforced laws for consumer protection, the environment, labor rights, and privacy issues. He's a champion of women's rights and fought big tobacco, helping to end deceptive marketing aimed at children. His work in support of veterans, consumer safety, transportation is exemplary. There is much more to mention, but for the sake of time, I'll stop. At the end of the senator's talk, we will have a Q&A led by Jim Marpe, Wise Men and former First Selectman of Westport. The questions will be asked from a list of those collected prior to today. I am happy to introduce to you now Senior United States Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. I can't tell you how excited and glad I am to be with you today, because the alternative would have been to remain in Washington, D.C. this morning on an equally overcast, rainy day, doing what fortunately we did last night, which is to extend the budget for another week so we could do an overall budget. The continuing resolution was necessary, but more important, to get the national defense budget done. We passed yesterday the National Defense Authorization Act, which sets the budget for the coming year. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. We work very, very hard to get it done, and it's always been done by the end of the session, despite sometimes the failure to get a budget done, but the defense budget authorization has always gotten done over the last 20 years. And as important as the budget itself is the fact that we do it in a bipartisan way. And the vote was overwhelming last night. I got home at about 1:30 this morning, and I'm happy to be with you. Thanks to Jim Marpe for taking some questions. I'm going to talk really briefly, and then really I welcome your questions, because I know from this group, having been with you before, in fact, I know the wise men began with the why, and I have very distinct and fond memories of going to the Y, the old Y, where we used to gather, and having this kind of very intimate and more intimate than this setting, and very frank, candid discussion. And I know your questions are going to be exactly that. I don't know whether Jen Tooker is here, but I know she had thought about coming, and I have worked with her and really thank her for her leadership in Westport. Jonathan Steinberg, my friend, state representative, is here this morning. I don't know whether any other elected leaders, but I'll welcome your questions as well. Anyone else? We are at the end of this session. We're at the beginning of a next session. And despite what your impression may be, I actually am very hopeful about this coming session, that there is the opportunity for bipartisan cooperation. It will have to be bipartisan, as you all know. The House will be under Republican control. There's some question about who the leader there will be, who the speaker will be, but one way or the other, if we get anything done, it's got to be bipartisan. And the reason I'm hopeful is that we've done some really important things in a bipartisan way during these last 6 months. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, and then I want to focus on one of the issues in particular, which is Ukraine, where we have been very distinctly bipartisan. The PAC Act, which provides care and benefits for veterans who've been exposed to toxins and poisons on the battlefield. I helped to lead this. It took years of work. But Jerry Moran and others on the Republican side, John Tester, myself on the Democratic side, members of the Veterans Affairs Committee, got it through, overcoming, by the way, opposition from the VA at earlier points, from the VA itself. But now veterans will have the opportunity for the kind of care and benefits that they need and deserve when they are exposed to these toxic chemicals, the burn pits and so forth, that cause cancer, hideous and really pernicious, cruel cancers, brain cancer, liver cancer, kidney cancer, and of course, skin cancer and other diseases. We got done some very important legislation on infrastructure in Westport, among other places, all throughout Fairfield County. We're going to see roads, work on the Saugatuck, all kinds of projects that will improve the environment, and the basic physical plant of our state and this town because of bipartisan cooperation on the infrastructure and jobs program. On Ukraine and on defense policy, we have a lot of bipartisan cooperation. We have some opposition from on both sides, in both parties, as you know. But Ukraine presents an opportunity and an obligation to push back on Putin's savage, genocidal, criminal invasion of Ukraine. I am very, very hopeful about the situation there. I have visited twice over the past year, and I was asked to be somewhat informal, to be personal about what I have to say here. So I do want to be personal about Ukraine, and specifically about the trips to Ukraine that I've taken, because I think it will give you some maybe personal view of the kind of work that I have the opportunity and the privilege to do. I first visited Ukraine before the invasion, and I met with President Zelensky, with top military leadership, with a number of Ukrainians, and it was before the most recent invasion. But when I asked President Zelensky whether he was fearful about the Russians invading, he said, they invaded in 2014. This is not an invasion, it's just more of the same. It's just more aggression. And he said he would not leave Ukraine under any circumstances. And of course, we were in a delegation of about 5 of us. And, you know, you've heard leaders make pledges, I'm not leaving, I won't sign this bill, I won't do this or that. But I came away convinced, not only he, but the Ukrainian people were in this fight to the end. And equally important, as I talked to, we had a number of military special operations people there, Army trainers and so forth. They were tremendously impressed by the will that they saw even then. And of course, they had been invaded in the Donetsk and Donbass region, Luhansk, as well as Crimea, and were fighting then and had lost already then about 17,000 lives of people. And I have been an advocate on the Armed Services Committee from the start of providing more lethal weapons, better arms, and humanitarian assistance. I came back and I said to the president, we are underestimating the Ukrainians, because everybody at that point thought if Putin invades, he'll be in Kyiv in a matter of days. And in fact, our own military underestimated their will and ability to resist. And sure enough, the invasion unfortunately came. I urged the president then to provide more arms right away, to provide humanitarian assistance right away in the hopes of deterring Putin. Now, we didn't do it, but we have since then provided a lot of aid. And when I went back to visit for a second time in July, what I saw was, in fact, that commitment redoubled and successful. By that time, you know, as you all know, they heroically and skillfully pushed the Russians back from Kyiv, where they were literally 20 minutes away from the capital. And they have succeeded beyond the expectations of our military and many around the world. But they are committed to the last man, the last person in that defense. And they will resist all of the bombing, all of the missiles, the drones, I have every confidence that they will continue to fight and fight successfully in resisting the Russians. But they need our arms. And they need humanitarian assistance, not just the arms that we've provided, but the Patriot missiles that we, fortunately, just a couple of days ago, decided to provide. HIMARS, the multiple launch artillery. In fact, what they really need is the system called ATACMS, which provide longer range than the HIMARS. In addition to Patriots, I think other self-defense, more drones are absolutely necessary, and planes, tanks. We need to regard the Ukraine fight as our fight, because obviously if Putin is successful there, he will keep going. There's no question in my mind that he will keep going. But there's also a moral issue here. When I visited Ukraine, we went to see President Zelensky, but we also went to some of the towns surrounding Kyiv, Bucha, Ilip, and I went with Lindsey Graham. Now, you may think Lindsey Graham and I are an unlikely couple. Well, you know, the way you get to Ukraine is you have to take a train. At least if you're an official, you have to take a train. You can't just fly into Kyiv. Nobody can fly into Kyiv these days. And so Lindsay and I, who have traveled before, we used to travel, as a matter of fact, with John McCain. I've traveled with McCain and Graham to the Middle East, to Libya, to Afghanistan. And McCain was a wonderful traveling companion. He was full of stories about his time in Vietnam, which were just profoundly moving. I can almost repeat them, many of them, having heard them more than once. But a man of just tremendous insight, good humor. And Lindsay also, I think, is distinguished by his sense of humor. Obviously, he disagrees, we disagree on a variety of issues, some extremely important. But where we agree, we work together, as we did, for example, on gun violence. He and I put together a bill on red flag statutes, which became part of the Safer Community Act that was passed in August, a bipartisan measure. And again, a reflection of our ability to get things done in a bipartisan way. So the way to get to Kyiv is by an overnight train. And it's kind of out of the 1950s. It's this antiquated sleeper train, at least a sleeper car. There are regular trains, as you might find on Metro North, a little older, but the sleeper car is out of the 1950s. It has compartments, and you know, you get on the train. It's fairly primitive, and the next day, having traveled overnight, we arrived in Kyiv. We went to see President Zelensky, and then we went out to the towns around Kyiv. And this was an experience that I will never forget, because what we saw was the mass graves. And we heard from townspeople about what they saw. Women and children, hands tied behind their backs. Not just a few here and there, but hundreds. And they had photographs of the mass graves as they were being dug, and bodies immediately after they were killed. This is genocide. Those people, women and children, shot in the back of the head or murdered even more brutally, were killed only because they are Ukrainians. And they are war crime. So I think my own passion in this fight is not just the geopolitical, national security, Putin will keep going, our defense, NATO is at stake, but there really is a moral imperative here. And I recognize we can't be the world's policeman, we can't be everywhere, we can't eradicate every immoral act, but being there with Lindsay and seeing the way that these people wanted to tell Americans about this experience. They wanted to tell Americans because, in their view, America can do the right thing. Americans will respond to the moral outrage of this situation. And even if it's just two senators, they wanted to tell their story to us. So these towns were 15 minutes by car from the president's office. The Russians were that close to him. The remains of the tanks and some of the artillery that the Russians had were still there. We could climb on top of them. That's how close Volodymyr Zelensky was to the Russians taking over the presidential offices. And that's what the Russians were doing 15 or 20 minutes outside of Kyiv, killing innocent Ukrainians. So you can understand why these people feel the way they do. It's their freedom, it's their independence, it's their lives, it's their women, their children, their hospitals, their schools, their communities that Vladimir Putin is destroying systematically. And it's not new to their history. As you know, Russia has always tried to dominate Ukraine. It abolished their language, literally abolished their language. It eradicated Bibles written in the Ukrainian language. This has been a centuries-old fight. And Vladimir Putin's ambition, namely to restore the old Mother Russia, is part of a centuries-old ambition as well. And his complaints about the dissolution of the old Soviet Union and wanting to restore it is not new, and it's not superficial or ephemeral. So this experience, the visit to Ukraine, has shaped my own view of America's role in this conflict, and fortunately, we have gone about it in a pretty sensible, cautious way. I have been in, I don't know how many classified briefings with our military, and I think my impression is that they are beginning to have more and more confidence in the Ukrainian military. The working relationships are better and better. The intelligence relationships are improving, and we are providing what they need, the arms they need. And there are dangers, there's no question about it. There are dangers of escalation. There are dangers of our being embroiled in or entangled in a war that we should not do with troops on the ground. American troops should not be involved, and we've been very careful about having no advisors, no training, no operatives there. There have been some American citizens who have volunteered, as you know, some of the veterans, but I think we are trying to walk a very sensible and deliberate line here, and so has NATO. And if you talk to some of our NATO allies, they get it. Sweden, Finland, who have seen the Russians in their own countries, over the years know what it means. And they will be as strong as the Ukrainians in this fight. My hope is that we will have, as part of the omnibus bill that will finish next week on Friday or earlier, a supplemental of probably between $30 and $40 billion in additional military aid. It will be challenging for our own defense production in this country. We will have to produce more to replenish our own stocks. The drawdown, both in NATO and here, will be a challenge. But I think it is a fight worth supporting. And I have been tremendously impressed by not just President Zelensky and his steadfastness, but also the entire, all of the Ukrainians I've met who are working under conditions, living under conditions that in this country would be absolutely intolerable. I don't know what the reaction would be here if they were living without consistent heat, light, electricity, water, all of the hardships that they face. But I'm convinced the Ukrainian people are going to stay the course. And I am planning to go back to Ukraine sometime in the next couple of months. The president has invited Lindsay and me to come back. We sponsored a measure to condemn Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which passed the Senate unanimously, the two of us. And we presented the resolution to President Zelensky. And again, just going to the moral support, for him, this was a really magnificent moment to see our Senate support him in this way unanimously. And of course, the military and humanitarian assistance matters so much as well. But never underestimate the moral force of America in this world. I know many of you have traveled far more than I have around the world. So you've seen it yourself. But it's something that we, I think, tend to forget sometimes. It's not just the example of our power, it's the power of our example. And we ought to be all the more focused on maintaining democracy at home, because it is the power of our example that inspires the world. So thank you very much for listening to me today and having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, and for being here today, and for a short night's sleep. I would have been, for making the effort to be here. We appreciate that very much, and thank you for the shout out and the point about working in a bipartisan way. I can personally testify to the efforts that you and your staff have made to help make Westport a better place. Most recently, of course, related to the dredging of the Saugatuck River, but a lot of other initiatives as well. And I know Jen Toker would express the same thing. She had to be somewhere else this morning, and but she asked me to send her regards as well, and appreciation for your cooperation and your team's cooperation with us. So thank you. So a lot of questions were submitted ahead of time, and I've tried to distill them and put them in some sort of order and sequence, and hopefully some that we'll get at, as you referenced in your talk. We intended this to maybe be also a little bit of the softer side of things, not a puff piece, but just to get to know you a little bit better. But having said that, you just finished, you're about to start your third term, and I know I'd be interested in your what are the one or two things you're proudest of having accomplished in the last dozen years? What are one or two disappointments that didn't get accomplished? And as importantly, looking forward to your next term, what are one or two things that you really hope to accomplish?
Well, thanks for the question. You know, what am I proudest of having done? I think the PAC Act, which I helped to lead, providing care and benefits for veterans who have been exposed to burn pits, but a variety of other veterans legislation, the Veteran Suicide Prevention Act. Suicide continues to be a scourge that affects veterans. And we've begun to make some inroads against it, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's both a source of pride and a source of additional challenge. I wish we had done more over these past years, but I worked on the Veterans Suicide Prevention Act with John McCain, as a matter of fact. So the work that I've done on veterans, the Safer Communities Act on gun violence, again, a step in the right direction on this anniversary on Wednesday of Sandy Hook, 10-year anniversary. Especially proud that we've made some progress on improving background checks, closing the boyfriend loophole, red flag statute, support crisis intervention, mental health. Happy about that accomplishment. The work that I've done on the Armed Services Committee on submarines and joint strike fighters and many of the special operators, two of my sons have served, one in the Marine Corps in Afghanistan, the other is a Navy SEAL. So I've really been very engaged. It's not the stuff that makes headlines, but as you probably know, some of the most important work that we do doesn't get into the headlines. And some of it is stopping bad things from happening. But in the military, just to give you one example, working on measures to stop sexual assault and changing some of the culture in the military around this issue. Still way too much, but we've made some progress. I've worked with colleagues, again, on both sides of the aisle. Joni Ernst from Iowa, Republican, myself, Senator Gillibrand. We've gotten some stuff done on the internet, trying to make it safer for children. As you know, they push a lot of toxic content, bullying, eating disorders, the algorithms. I have a bill that could get passed. I'm not sure whether it will. It's called the Kids Online Safety Act, but it has helped to change some of the practices on the internet. And likewise, competition, antitrust. I think we'll see some legislation on that. And consumer protection has been a very important goal. What's most discouraging, I'll just be very blunt, has been the increasing polarization, partisan, some of it, a lot of it. I'm hoping that we can help restore some greater measure of cooperation. The measures that I've mentioned, I think, provide a template. One of my colleagues, just to tell you sort of an anecdote, one of my colleagues and one of my good friends in the Senate, Jerry Moran of Kansas, we've worked together on the Olympic athletes issues when the Olympic athletes were, you probably heard of Larry Nassar. Larry Nassar, as a predator, was able to do what he did because of the lack of protections for young athletes, principally women athletes, gymnasts, swimmers, others. Anyway, Jerry Moran and I have worked very closely on a number of things, and he came up to me this week and he said, "I've been looking for you because one of my constituents told me about what you said." And I said, "Jerry, I apologize if He said, no, one of my constituents was visiting Connecticut, and she asked whether you knew me, and you said, Jerry Moran is an excellent senator, and he's a good friend. And he said, now, if you had mentioned that during the campaign, it might have gotten me in trouble. But he said, thank you for the compliment. So taking advantage of more of the personal relationships, I think, would be, my regret is that we've seen the partisanship, and I hope to continue working in those areas.
Well, then that relates to a question that one of our members submitted, and I'll quote it so I get it right. Why doesn't Congress get more done? It seems that the priorities of its constituents get lost in polarization, self-interest, and obsession with fundraising and re-election. Now, ironically, on Wednesday, the anniversary of Sandy Hook, you spoke on the floor of the Senate saying parents, teachers, and first responders, I'm paraphrasing, all do their jobs, but Congress is not doing their job. Now, that was specifically related to gun control, I understand, but I think it could apply more generally. So how would you go about fixing this problem, at least that some of us see in Congress? Is term limits the answer? And then just to add to the complexity of someone like Senator Semina taking her own Declaration of Independence, for lack of a better term.
I don't think there's a magic panacea. And I think when you ask me, I think some of the answer you already know, because we see it in our society, we see it in our political system. I've just been through an election, and I am out there a lot. I go to a lot of events. I'm all around the state, fairs, parades. One of my opponents once said about me, Blumenthal, if there's a garage door opening, he'll be at it. Which he meant as an insult. But actually, I take it as a badge of pride. I talk to people, I listen to people, I try to reach people where they live, what they believe, and I have found it's more difficult to talk to some people on the extremes. And I'm not singling out, Republicans, Democrats, but I think our public discourse has become coarser, sometimes violent in the way things are expressed, and sometimes actually violent in its intention. The insurrection on January 6th was an alarm for our democracy. It was an insurrection. It was an attempt to block democracy, the peaceful transition of power, and the convictions that we're seeing, criminal convictions, I hope will deter it, but I am worried about the threat of violence. If you look at the surveys, there are groups of people on both sides who say violence is justified if I don't get what I want. That isn't how they put it. Violence is justified if I dispute the results of an election. Now, I suspect nobody in this room supports that view. But the reason why Congress can't get more done is because the extremes exercise more influence. And frankly, I think also because we have failed to make the effort to work on specific issues more than we do, which is why I think those measures that I cited for you, gun violence, where we've made progress, infrastructure. We're going to pass, I hope, the Electoral Count Act, which would clarify the law relating to the presidential election that left open the ambiguities leading to January 6th. A number of other areas where I think we can work together. Ukraine, defense, helping veterans. Those are my focus, where we can come together. And you know from your business dealings, the way to begin a negotiation is not to start where you think you may never come together. It's to start where you have common ground. So that's going to be my focus in the coming months.
Yeah. Well, as you know, assuming the Congress's January 6th committee issues its report, I presume in the coming week, what do you think will happen next with that? And then in the introduction, mentioning your father's escape from Nazi Germany triggered the thought about the business in Germany in the last week or so, where they arrested people who were planning some kind of government overthrow. How realistic, I don't know, but what the implications then to our own country from that as well. So a bunch of questions bundled in there, I suppose, but you understand the topic.
A big topic. My dad came to this country in 1935 to escape the Holocaust or Nazi Germany, and he had not much more than the shirt on his back. He was 17 years old. 17 years old. He spoke virtually no English. He knew no one. He had pretty much nothing. And this country gave him a chance to succeed. He loved this country. And as a teenager, I would say to him, you know, we live in America. That could never happen here. The Holocaust could never happen here. And he said, can happen anywhere that good people do not stand up. Anti-Semitism, anti-black, anti-Muslim, anti-Catholic can happen anywhere. That hate is allowed to flourish without people standing up. And I think the Germans are aware of the cancer of the far right. As you know, it's been reported publicly, so it's no secret. The German conspirators were inspired by some of the right-wing conspiracy theories in this country. And going back to our friend Vladimir Putin, he has tried to encourage, in this country, 2016, well documented, divisions. He's tried to divide the democracies. He thinks the democracies are weak. He thinks we're a bunch of flabby, self-interested, selfish, money-grasping capitalists who will be divided. And the conspiracy theories, the right wing, the encouragement, the funding, he has funded these right-wing groups throughout Europe. So when we talk about the threat to democracy, we should be aware of the need for all of us to stand up and be counted and denounce hate when we see it. And, you know, I'm just going to be really frank, because I haven't mentioned his name so far, but Donald Trump has been a pretty bad influence. And my hope is the Republicans whom I know, who are friends of mine in the Senate, will separate themselves from him. And fortunately, I think his influence seemed to be waning in the Republican Party. And, you know, by the way, we need a two-party system in this country. Connecticut is a great example of it. We have been a strong two-party state. When I was Attorney General for 20 years in the state of Connecticut, I never served under a Democratic governor. We had Republican or independent governors. Lowell Weicker for 4 years, and then for the remaining 16 years, Republican governors. And I want to see a two-party system in this state. Chris Shays is an example of it. And if we don't have a two-party system, we are weaker than we should be. So kind of a long-winded, roundabout answer to your question, but I think it is a worldwide phenomenon. The threat of these right-wing, armed, and very purposeful movements that can disrupt our democracy.
Thank you. Your comment about the garage door opening reminds me that you are probably one of the most visible political figures in Connecticut, and thank you for all the time you devote to being there for whatever the event is. And I know I could generally count on seeing you at some things that otherwise I might not have expected to see a U.S. Senator at. But some inquiring minds here want to know, to the extent you have any spare time, and again, I have full appreciation for the 24/7 nature of your job, my job, same thing, but there are days off, I suppose, or at least hours off. What do you do with that spare time? How do you clear your head? How do you unwind? And because we're in a library, what books are on your nightstand if you take time to read?
I do a lot of reading, and I do a lot of listening to books. I'm reading a wonderful book right now called The Emperor of Maladies about cancer. A bit depressing, but puts a lot in perspective when I think about the personal issues in my life, to see the historic efforts against cancer and the progress of invention and research and discovery and the lives lost. You know, the part of the book I'm reading right now is about children suffering from leukemia. And, you know, I have become, partly as a result of the pandemic, focused on issues of public health and nutrition. Just a bit of fact, 40% of all food made in the United States, 40% is wasted. From supermarkets where it doesn't look quite right, restaurants, your refrigerator, 40% of all food in the United States is disposed. And by the way, it goes into waste fields where it creates air contamination. But I learned a lot by reading. I read a lot of history or listen. When I have spare time, I try to spend it with my family. We have 4 children, and 2 of them are married. 2, I hope, are close. And we, Cynthia and I, spend as much time as we can with our children, and then I try to stay in shape physically. I don't do as much running as I used to. I used to run marathons, but I do a lot of swimming, a lot of exercise. This morning, even though I was operating on very little sleep, I took about an hour to stay in shape. It enables me to feel like, you know, I got enough sleep, keeps me sane. So I lead a very boring life, I have to confess that I don't do as much cultural activity as I would like, you know, in terms of theater and music. But it's hard for me to sort of schedule things and to know that I'm going to be free.
And can we expect a digital Blumenthal trading card coming up? I suspect the answer is no, but I would...
Probably not.
Something is now it's constantly in the news, but got back in the news related to our southern border with the expiration of Title 42, which I'm not sure exactly what all that covered. But the point is, regardless of presidents for the last 20 years have struggled with the issue of border and the broader issue of immigration. I would be interested in your thoughts on how we move forward on that issue.
Sure. Well, we have a humanitarian crisis. We need to do something about the border. We need stronger border security. We need to fix the immigration system. We have a broken system. It is broken. And the fix needs to include stronger security at the border. A wall is not the answer, but we have means of surveillance. We have means of preventing people from coming across the border. Technology, surveillance, manpower, the flow of fentanyl across the border, not just people, but drugs. It's a major problem. But it's not the undocumented people, by and large, who are carrying those drugs. It's at the checkpoints. These cartels are huge, multi-billion-dollar businesses. They use submarines, they use planes, they use helicopters, they use tunnels, they use cars coming through Tijuana and other checkpoints. So we need a completely different approach to the border with more financing, but we also need to fix the system that relates to 11 to 13 million people here in this country who are undocumented and who have been here for decades and who are, by the way, working at your homes or your businesses or the place where you're buying, your groceries. They're paying taxes. They have families. They have children born here. So saying, well, we're going to just deport all the undocumented is not the answer. And by the way, the most common complaint from businesses I get as I go around the state of Connecticut, you all know what I'm going to say. We can't find people to fill these jobs. We have jobs. We can't find people to fill them at every level. Washing dishes in restaurants, skilled people in the high-tech industries, electricians at Electric Boat where they make submarines, welders at every level. So the people who are here, the undocumented who are here, somehow we need to provide a path to citizenship, including the DACA recipients who came here as children. They were brought here as infants, as 3-year-olds. And their parents stayed, and a lawyer, I'm not proud to say because I'm a lawyer, advised them, well, just stay out of trouble, you'll be fine. Don't worry. You're undocumented, but a lot of people are. And they didn't do anything. And then ICE shows up at their door and says, we're deporting your husband. We need a rational, sensible approach. And we need to make it bipartisan. And for anybody in this room who says it can't be done, it can be done. We did it in 2013. We had a bill that addressed all of these issues and provided more skilled workers for the businesses of Connecticut and the country, H-1B. And we enabled students who study here. This is something I will never understand. Students who are in our universities and they learn all the stuff we need in this country, and we tell them, you can't stay here. Go back to China. Doesn't make much sense, does it? Well, in 2013, we had a bill that passed the United States Senate overwhelmingly bipartisan, 2013. John McCain, John Cornyn, others on the Republican side, myself, Michael Bennet, Dick Durbin, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives wouldn't give it a vote. John Boehner wouldn't allow it to come to the floor. It would have passed. And the history of this country would have been totally different. So I think we can do it. And one of my goals is to try to help make it happen.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time. We've reached the top of the hour. One more question that's more specific to Connecticut and relates to jobs. Sikorsky apparently has lost a major contract to replace its Black Hawk helicopter. I expect that decision will get appealed in the way those kinds of things get appealed. But nevertheless, there is the risk of what is, I think, half of their production line having nothing to do. How do you see that playing out? And so your role as being on the Armed Services Committee, I think, would be a very important and influential one.
Yeah. Well, I'm disappointed by the decision. This decision about the next iteration of the Black Hawk is the best way to think of it. It has an acronym, is in the planning stage right now. The actual production wouldn't be for several years. In the meantime, Black Hawks will continue to be produced at Sikorsky. There's also a lot of work to be done on repairs, on maintenance. Sikorsky is going to stay busy over the next few years. It also has the search and rescue helicopter. I have championed the search and rescue helicopter. The Air Force wasn't wild about it, but I think it's important, and the rest of the military thinks it's important. Marine One, it will be producing over the next few years as well. And the Black Hawk's going to stay in production for other countries because they can't afford the newfangled thing that's being developed. So they're, you know, the Black Hawk is, each of the services has different copies, as they say in the military, different forms that are adapted to the different services. And they're going to continue to need Black Hawks, in my view. And the CH-53K, which is the heavy lift, the Marine Corps version, will continue to be in production. All of that is to say, I am very hopeful and optimistic about Sikorsky over the coming years. And again, competition is a good thing. You know, Bell got this contract. Bell beat Sikorsky, but we're not sure what the reasons were. And we're digging into the reasons because we think one of the reasons may have been that they simply wanted to keep Bell's workforce intact, which is a consideration. You want to keep the industrial base intact, but if it costs more money and it's less effective, those considerations ought to outweigh some of the others. So on the Armed Services Committee, we're going to be digging into it. Congresswoman DeLauro, myself, have said that we want to know exactly what the Army's thinking was, and there may well be a protest leading to a challenge. Sikorsky has to make that decision on its own, and we'll see what they do. But long-term, Sikorsky is, and Sikorsky's workforce are really treasures in the defense industry, and I'm very bullish about its future.
Well, good. It's the holiday season, so it's nice to end on an optimistic note. As you can see here, there are a pile of questions that we didn't get to, so we'll have to have you back soon. And
I will be happy to be back.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking the time with us
Thank
today.
you.
Happy holidays to you.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays to all of you.
Yeah, to all of you. Thank you.